Hello and welcome to episode 3 of the Canon Reviewed, a podcast that looks at old books with new eyes and examines their continued relevance to contemporary readers. I'm your host, Daniel, and I'm delighted that you're here. In this episode, we'll be looking at one of the most exceptional protagonists in 19th century literature, Hester Prynne, a model of strength and perseverance who almost seems to exist out of time, as well as her precocious, impish daughter, Pearl. So please, pull up a chair by the fire, and let's continue our discussion of Nathaniel Hawthorne's The Scarlet Letter. Hester Prynne's term of confinement was now at an end. Her prison door was thrown open, and she came forth into the sunshine, which, falling on all alike, seemed, to her sick and morbid heart, as if meant for no other purpose than to reveal the scarlet letter on her breast. Perhaps there was a more real torture in her first unattended footsteps from the threshold of the prison than even in the procession and spectacle that have been described, where she was made the common infamy at which all mankind was summoned to point its finger. Then she was supported by an unnatural tension of the nerves and by all the combative energy of her character, which enabled her to convert the scene to a kind of lurid triumph. It was, moreover, a separate and insulated event, to occur but once in her lifetime, and to meet which, therefore, reckless of economy, she might call up the vital strength that would have sufficed for many quiet years. The very law that condemned her, a giant of stern features but with vigor to support, as well as to annihilate in his iron arm, had held her up through the terrible ordeal of her ignominy. But now, with this unattended walk from her prison door began the daily custom, and she must either sustain and carry it forward by the ordinary resources of her nature, or sink beneath it. She could no longer borrow from the future to help her through the present grief. Tomorrow would bring its own trial with it, so would the next day, and so would the next. Each its own trial, and yet the very same that was now so unutterably grievous to be borne. The days of the far-off future would toil onward, still with the same burden for her to take up and bear along with her, but never to fling down. For the accumulating days and added years would pile up their misery upon the heap of shame. Throughout them all, giving up her individuality, she would become the general symbol at which the preacher and moralist might point, and in which they might vivify and embody their images of women's frailty and sinful passion. Plus, the young and pure would be taught to look at her, with the scarlet letter flaming on her breast, at her, the child of honorable parents, at her, the mother of a babe that would hereafter be a woman, at her who had once been innocent, as the figure, the body, the reality of sin, and over her grave, the infamy that she must carry thither would be her only monument. We have already had Hester's defiant exit from the prison, been witness to her public strength, but here we're introduced to her interior life, her thinking, and her spiritual crisis. I've said a number of times that Hawthorne was a progressive writer and well ahead of his times, and at his especial best when describing the ways in which a regressive social or communal beliefs push against an individual. And now we see and feel that. What is Hester's life like? Well, in short, it's terrible. But before we get into the hows and whys of that, I want to bring up the subject that will dominate much of the discussion around Hester and Hawthorne's depiction of her life, and her mindset. I have always looked on Hester, on her character, as a paragon of strength and courage in the face of constant and grim adversity. When we're allowed inside her head, we witness how she personally confronts her demons and her detractors. We see a determined, moral, and complex individual who somehow exists in bright color against the gray backdrop in which she finds herself. Now, we'll talk more about this next week in our conclusion episode, but I've always considered Hester as a kind of icon of pre-feminism, and while I don't think Hawthorne himself is any kind of feminist, He wouldn't even know what that meant, really. I see in his rendering of a deeply thoughtful, introspective, and sympathetic character an unusual breakaway from the hyper male aesthetic of storytelling at the time. Yet, there's another read of Hester Prynne entirely, one that examines the natures of those traits I label as strengths and sees them more as weaknesses, or worse, as the stereotypical view of womanhood at Hawthorne's time, and before his time, and continuing afterwards into the present. I think this mostly comes from the fact that it's Hawthorne who is providing the window through which we see Hester Prynne, and that the distance between his universe and a woman like Hester's is simply too great a gap to bridge. It's not as simple as just saying that because Hawthorne was a man, white and of privilege as well, it's impossible that he could authentically tap into the mind, heart, and soul of a female character. Many younger readers have stopped their thinking at that point, to be sure, but I consider that kind of response to a book and writer as, well, reductive and not particularly useful. But there are indeed moments where Hawthorne, all his sensitivity towards her notwithstanding, slips up with Hester. Looking at those, examining them, is important in a discussion of a book like this. Hawthorne's no god and capable of error, but when we consider his time and place, it's actually pretty amazing that he could paint a character like Hester Prynne, that he actually cares enough to even try to imagine what might be taking place in her interior world. Still, that's no shield from criticism, and many readers of this book have found in Hester Prynne yet another example of, if not the male gaze, the male's simplification of what should be a complex female character. Every time I read this book, I climb right back on the fence about the whole thing. Just when I'm ready to celebrate her victories and Hawthorne's greatness, I see something I'd forgotten or never encountered before, and I'm back to hesitation. Again, it's not so simple a question as asking whether or not a man can write from the perspective of a woman with any power or integrity. I mean, that kind of thinking leads down a path heading straight for the death of art and imagination. To say that an author can only authentically write from the point of view of a character who is basically the same as them is pointlessly stifling and even short-sighted. Or is it? Do I say that because I am a white male whose species has been the primary source of storytelling for centuries? A species that's created thousands of non-white, non-male characters and done a handful of them some justice? Do I just want to believe that Hawthorne tapped into something pure and authentic? I mean, really, I'd have no way of knowing if he's successful, right? As a teacher, this question would sometimes paralyze me, and I look forward to hearing how others view the issue. I side with the creator more than the critic most of the time, but I see in the character of Hester Prynne one of the best examples of a man entering the interior world of a woman and finding something there that rings of truth, even if it can't quite grasp the totality. Well, let's get back to what Hester is up against in the story, and then we'll definitely return to this discussion later. Earlier, we said that Hawthorne was at his best when he critiques social, political, or community things, and that's certainly true with his depiction of the sad, isolated, and abused life led by Hester Prynne. It isn't enough for the Puritans to force the Scarlet Letter itself upon her. It can't simply be a single incident of public shame. No, she needs to be continuously ostracized, belittled, and denigrated, and the people around her hide their contemptuous delight in making her life miserable behind a screen of religious zealotry and piety. Therefore, one is completely justified in casting aspersions at one's neighbor, and for sure never letting her forget the sin she'll be forever connected to. Ugh. But just as Hester's society is relentless in its hate, so too is Hawthorne in his talking about the hypocrites, know-it-alls, and stodgy jerks that surround her. One gets the feeling that Hawthorne admires, even loves Hester Prynne, and this book is in a way a kind of defense against the type of regressive thinking and behavior that wounds those so undeserving of that treatment. But I'm getting ahead of myself. What is Hester's life like? That was our question. Well, again, it's pretty terrible. She lives, half by choice, half not so much, on the outskirts of town in a recently abandoned cottage. You remember how she emerged from the prison and all the town scolds marveled at her needlework? Well, they still do. And Hester actually makes pretty good money as a tailor. I was surprised by that when I first read the book because I figured they'd just kind of leave her to die out there. But then I realized it's actually just another opportunity for them to treat her abominably. But again, Hawthorne is so great about this. The ladies come, they get her to make fancy dresses, they scowl at her the whole time, they don't look at her when they pay, and often they'll feel quite free to offer their opinions on her character. All the while, she's crafting beautiful things for them. Then, her work becomes fashionable. Oh, is that a Hester Prynne? And the reason it does so is partly because of the scandal associated with her. It's like they get to sin a little bit, but adjacently, and don't have to feel the pangs of eternal torment like their insufficiently paid seamstress. There's something just so modern about this. Anyway, she can't walk around town without getting looked at, talked about, run from, all that kind of lovely stuff. Kids treat her horribly, and she's more terrified of them than anyone else, for they echo the terrible things they've heard their parents say about her. And strangers can't take their eyes off the letter. When she goes to church, the preacher will suddenly change his sermon and make it about her. And it's clear that this will never change. Nonetheless, Hester is charitable and kind, never breaks or returns the insults or jabs, never even seeks to defend herself. She makes clothes for the poor and needy who spit on her as they take the handouts. And she keeps at it day after day. Why? Why doesn't she just get the hell out of Boston? Hester has her external world, which is awful, but her internal one as well, which is complicated and tortured, and Hawthorne dives deeply into it. Let's just see how he does it, what thoughts he gives his protagonist, before we assess whether or not he was successful at it or even has any business doing so. So why does she stay? Hawthorne says this about it, and it's beautiful. There is a fatality, a feeling so irresistible and inevitable that it has the force of doom, which almost invariably compels human beings to linger around and haunt, ghost-like, the spot where some great and marked event has given the color of their lifetime. And still the more irresistibly, the darker the tinge that saddens it, her sin, her ignominy, were the roots which she had struck into the soil. That's so true, and I think represents half the reason Hester stays in Boston. The other half has something to do with the spiritual and religious backdrop of the novel. It's not just the clergy and the townsfolk who buy whole hog into the God stuff. Hester does too. She's no heathen, though she may be treated as one. She understands that she sinned, broke a rule, and even believes that she must pay for it in some way. She doesn't see herself as a victim, and that's important to her character, as it's one of the many examples of her strength. So, sure, people have a tendency to remain in those places where something momentous happened to them. But Hester can find no atonement by running away. Since this was the place of her guilt, it should be the place of her punishment and eventual redemption. I mean, she won't take the letter off even when she's alone at home. I think that's pretty cool, and I like that it forces us to remember that Hester is no alien being in this universe, but rather, she belongs here. She is completely of this time and place. Sort of. Now, Hawthorne accuses her of being half delusional because she'll most likely find no respite in Boston. Ever. Because she is different from these people. She sees things more clearly and feels things more deeply. And through her pain and humiliation, Hawthorne gets us to render a similar judgment to his on the society around Hester Prynne. So yes, Hester is isolated, at home with her demons and daily scarred by the plethora of ways others have to hurt her. Isolated, yes. But she isn't alone. She has Pearl. And what would she do without her? How could she live? We ended last week's episode introducing Hester's daughter, and today we'll examine their relationship. Remember, Pearl emerged from the prison with her mother, and the two of them have been inseparably associated since that moment. They go everywhere together, and all the scorn heaped upon Hester falls on Pearl as well. For as Hawthorne says of her, Pearl was a born outcast of the infantile world, an imp of evil, emblem and product of sin. She had no right among christened infants. Yep, that's how the Puritans viewed the child, and it's pretty reprehensible in its unfairness and lack of courtesy. But unlike her mother, Pearl doesn't really take that crap that her community throws at her. Call her a devil, will you? Okay, here comes the devil. She feels no compulsion to honor anyone who mistreats her, could care less what anyone, including her mother, wants for her, and seems driven by some internal engine that moves randomly through hundreds of wildly disparate emotional gears. She's completely unpredictable, 1,000% genuine, and absolutely fearless. And when we really get to know her, she's just 7. She is Hester's treasure. In fact, Hester refers to her daughter in terms like that all the time. And in their total aloneness, you could see how Hester would see her child that way and how Pearl would come to believe it. It seems like a pretty natural evolution for mother and daughter outcasts, and interestingly, yields great power to the child. She knows no discipline, certainly not of the kind common to those Puritans around her who do not spare the rod, and her innate precociousness is limitless. At the governor's house, she seemed unfazed by the proceedings, but the spectacle she made of herself only appeared to lend credence to the clerical fears of her origins. Now, not surprisingly, Pearl is also a ball of radiant sunshine, awe-inspiring like most things that engender horror, delight, and mystery. There is, too, a parallel between Hester and Pearl and Dimmesdale and Chillingworth. The power dynamic is one-sided, and like Chillingworth is to Dimmesdale, Pearl is Hester's daily antagonist, to the point where Hester, like everyone else in Boston, wonders whether or not Pearl doth indeed cometh from yon infernal depths. Hester never feels safe with or around Pearl. And I think that choice of word is deeply important. Pearl is too mercurial, too moody, and she's as ready with her hugs and smiles as she is her scornful words and aloofness. I love those moments in the book where Hester is just watching Pearl out in the world, seeing her as a foreign entity she can't quite fathom, because it seems, as a parent, so real. Who can hurt you quite like your children, right? Sure, old matron Witherbutt can say mean things to you as you're embroidering her gown, but whatever. Only Pearl can summon the requisite witchcraft to ensure her mother has a heart by breaking it. But they are also a single unit, and that fact too is gut-wrenching to Hester. As Hawthorne says, it was inexpressibly sad. Then what depth of sorrow to a mother, who felt in her own heart the cause, to observe in one so young this constant recognition of an adverse world, and so fierce a training of the energies that were to make good her cause in the contest that must ensue. Hester must try and get Pearl to understand that she's reviled because of something her mother did, as if she must daily announce to her daughter, "I am the cause of your suffering, your loneliness." Though, to be honest, Pearl never once seems to really care that it's just her and her mom against the world. She actually welcomes it, relishes it even. I feel like Pearl is the Hester that Hester wishes she could be, but sadly, all those adult concerns and responsibilities are too overwhelming to ignore. Pearl is all id, and Hester, well, never once given a moment of comfort or security, must make do with the little imp ever at her side, so busy keeping her safe that the joy she should be taking in the gift that is Pearl, the one thing giving meaning and substance to her life, is withheld from her. Well, all that said, whereas Chillingworth and Dimmesdale destroy each other in the end, Hester and Pearl remain together. Fixed, in a sense. In fact, Pearl comes out the winner of the story. And Hester, well, she doesn't lose. But all of Pearl's youthful antics and antagonism towards Hester prepares her for the events to come. For Pearl's effect on her mother is to turn her inward, into a thinker, to turn her passion and feeling into thought. Pearl allows her to see the world differently, or maybe as it really is. Pearl has lived her whole life associating her mother with the Scarlet Letter, and it's given Hester the opportunity to re-examine the symbol's meaning in her life. Hester has changed, for the circumstances of her life have hardened her, turned her somewhat cold, somewhat analytical. The effect of the symbol, or rather, of the position in respect to society that was indicated by it, on the mind of Hester Prynne herself was powerful and peculiar. Some attribute had departed from her, the permanence of which had been essential to keeping her a woman. Such is frequently the fate, and such the stern development, of the feminine character in person, when the woman has encountered and lived through an experience of peculiar severity. If she be all tenderness, she will die. If she survive, the tenderness will either be crushed out of her or crushed so deeply into her heart that it can never show itself more. She who has once been a woman and ceased to be so might at any moment become a woman again, if there were only the magic touch to effect the transfiguration. We're approaching that moment in the woods with Dimmesdale, where she begs his forgiveness and schemes to run away with him, and it's at that point where the very easy critical reading emerges, that collective eye roll that dismisses any notion whatsoever that this could be, in any way, a feminist novel. See, we so readily cry, there she goes, running to a man. But does she? How does she get to this point? Before she meets up with Dimmesdale in the forest, a scene we actually discover she had engineered, we need to get back inside her head and her heart. Here, too, Hawthorne may overstep, may be giving to Hester an internal monologue that he has no business doing, but it is, nevertheless, a clear and deep explanation of her motivation. Let's go to the book for a long moment. Hester has just contemplated the nature of womanhood, has wondered if living is even worth it. She sounds like Hamlet, actually, when everything seems to throw into acute reality that this is a man's world, that the lot of woman is servitude and suffering. And who's going to change it? Men? Hardly. And women are kept from the ability to affect it in any way. She's in the midst of a total and absolute existential crisis when she realizes she really has two options. Give in to the darkness, let the Scarlet Letter win by thoroughly demoralizing and defeating her, or not. She was ready to submit to the desperate and harsh reality of her situation, but just then she thinks of Dimmesdale and when she last saw him during his psychotic midnight vigil. Now, however, her interview with the Reverend Mr. Dimmesdale on the night of his vigil had given her a new theme of reflection, and held up to her an object that appeared worthy of any exertion and sacrifice for its attainment. She had witnessed the intense misery beneath which the minister struggled, or, to speak more accurately, had ceased to struggle. She saw that he stood on the verge of lunacy, if he had not already stepped across it. It was impossible to doubt that, whatever painful efficacy there might be in the secret sting of remorse, a deadlier venom had been infused into it by the hand that proffered relief. A secret enemy had been continually by his side, under the semblance of a friend and helper, and had availed himself of the opportunities afforded for tampering with the delicate springs of Mr. Dimmesdale's nature. Hester could not but ask herself whether there had not originally been a defect of truth, courage, and loyalty on her own part in allowing the minister to be thrown into a position where so much evil was to be foreboded, and nothing auspicious to be hoped. Her only justification lay in the fact that it had been able to discern no method of rescuing him from the blacker ruin that had overwhelmed herself, except by acquiescing in Roger Chillingworth's scheme of disguise. Under that impulse, she had made her choice, and had chosen, as it now appeared, the more wretched alternative of the two. She determined to redeem her error, so far as it might yet be possible. Strengthened by years of hard and solemn trial, she felt herself no longer so inadequate to cope with Roger Chillingworth as on that night, abased by sin and half-maddened by the ignominy that was still new when they had talked together in the prison chamber. She had climbed her way, since then, to a higher point. The old man, on the other hand, had brought himself nearer to her level, or perhaps below it, by the revenge which he had stooped for. What has made Hester an exceptional character to this point, and I use the term exceptional to mean what it really means, is that she is a woman without a man. Her story doesn't require it. Of course, we know from last week that won't be the case by the end of the novel, but she has gone a long time without anyone but Pearl. And while we can't call her happy, we can view her as complete. She doesn't need Dimmesdale. And here we learn that it isn't love, not really, that makes her resolve to save Dimmesdale from his pathetic self. She sees him losing his mind and feels partly responsible for it. This is another exercise of her strength and fortitude. She's already been depicted as a model of charity and compassion, and here, once again, she's trying to do the right thing and save someone she can. This scene in the woods is actually as much about Chillingworth as it is Dimmesdale, I think. Hester has lived a long time without Dimmesdale, and I bet she saw him every day. And not once does Hawthorne say anything about it. She's not longing for him, dwelling on him. Nothing. She's caught up in her own life and her responsibilities for her daughter. She's okay. He's not. I don't know. Maybe she's thinking broadly about a future together, a father for her child. Who knows? Not us. The reasons she'll give Arthur for running away together is so that he can start again, continue to do his good work somewhere else, unburdened by his shame and whatever other demons he's all freaked out about. But armed as we are with our suspicions and the many examples we have to support them, we just assume that this is a story about two star-crossed lovers, that she's nothing without her man, and has only felt that absence her whole life. Sure, upon first reading, I know I felt that that was probably what the novel was about, and I was super pissed when I first read the moment where she falls on her knees and begs him for forgiveness. But I realized that that's a character moment, not an author moment. Hester has tortured herself for so long that of course she sees the blame as hers more than anyone's. And maybe she did kind of do Dimmesdale wrong a little bit. She doesn't owe him anything, sure, but she withheld Chillingworth's intentions and identity and was part of a scheme that hurt the young minister. She wants to put Dimmesdale back together again, and this scene was more about her finding her strength and resolve to encounter her husband again and try to undermine the menace he represents. So, I think we can say this about the Scarlet Letter. It's not a love story. This isn't another Romeo and Juliet scenario. We're not looking at the tale of forbidden love and how it can be circumvented. This is an incredibly mature story about redemption, about not giving in to despair, about resisting the trek down the easy path of bitterness, spite, and revenge. Hester is, as I have said a number of times, amazing. Look what life has handed her, and imagine yourself dealing with it. I am quite certain that I'd be no Hester Prynne. Now, I know it seems like I'm arguing vociferously for a particular reading of the novel, or at least insofar as it relates to the argument we began this episode with regarding Hester as an icon. I still don't know how I feel about whether or not Hawthorne wields the authority to get into Hester's head and root around inside it. At one point in her crisis, she contemplates ending not only her life, but Pearl's as well, as she wonders if that's really the only viable option for someone in her position. Hawthorne has her question too if existence is worth it even for the happiest of women. I've had students bristle at that too. And of course, there's one point in the book where our author glibly states that the fondness women have for needlework is one of the great mysteries to men. To be fair, he says this after he points out the inequities that women face regarding what kind of work they're allowed to do. And there are moments wherein one could easily read that Hester's intentions behind saving Dimmesdale are partly to do with having a future with him. When she introduces Pearl to him, she implores that he must know our daughter. And today's final reading will perhaps also provide some ambiguity about her intentions. Like I said, I don't know. And I waffle a great deal with this book. And maybe, that's a good thing. A part of its richness. I really don't know. I think an author's core responsibility is to be sincere, to give an honest and earnest effort towards revealing their characters' intentions and motivations. Hawthorne accomplishes that in my mind, and though he may not get everything right about his heroine's internal world, she is a fully formed, deeply complex character who is more than just a victim of society and circumstance. She possesses agency and actively controls her own life in the novel, despite what our assumptions regarding the book, or this type of book, might be. There is so much more to say about all this, and we certainly will next week. But for now, thank you so much for sitting by the fire with me today. Please rate and review the podcast, as it makes it easier for others to find. And if you like what you're hearing and intrigued by where it's going, please consider supporting the show on Patreon at patreon.com/The Canon Reviewed. You'll find a few tiers to choose from, including joining a monthly book club, as well as an invite to our Discord community. Finally, since this podcast is a conversation as much as anything else, send an email to thecanonreviewed@gmail.com with your thoughts and observation about the works under study. Today, a special thank you to one of our keepers of the tomes, Thew Elliott. I really appreciate the support. And to our first head librarian, Jeff Seplak. You're awesome, sir. Now, if you'd like to join Jeff in the offices of the head librarians, just head over to Patreon and choose the 4th tier. As soon as we get 6 head librarians, we'll start our monthly book club on the Discord server, and I'm super excited for that. Well, I hope you join me next week when we conclude our discussion of the Scarlet Letter. I'll leave you today with Hester's last look upon Dimmesdale before he climbs the stage for his dramatic exit. He's leading the procession and doesn't even look at Hester as he passes. Hester Prynne, gazing steadfastly at the clergyman, felt a dreary influence come over her, but wherefore or whence she knew not, unless that he seemed so remote from her own sphere and utterly beyond her reach. One glance of recognition, she had imagined, must needs pass between them. She thought of the dim forest, with his little dell of solitude, and love, and anguish, and the mossy tree trunk where, sitting hand in hand, they had mingled their sad and passionate talk with the melancholy murmur of the brook. How deeply had they known each other then? And was this the man? She hardly knew him now. He, moving proudly past, enveloped as it were in the rich music, with the procession of majestic and venerable fathers, he, so unattainable in his worldly position, and still more so in that far vista of his unsympathizing thoughts, through which she now beheld him. Her spirits sank with the idea that all must have been a delusion, and that, vividly as she had dreamed it, there could be no real bond betwixt the clergyman and herself. And thus, much of woman was there in Hester that she could scarcely forgive him, least of all now, when the heavy footsteps of their approaching fate might be heard, nearer, nearer, nearer. For being able so completely to withdraw himself from their mutual world, while she groped darkly and stretched forth her cold hands, and found him not.